Let's bring in ABC News contributor, former UK national security official Steve Hill for more. Hi, Steve. So you say whether military action takes place or not, Trump's threats to Greenland have already damaged the fabric of NATO. What do you mean by that?
Well, just putting the idea that one NATO ally can be attacking another NATO ally undermines the alliance. And the reality is that the US does have legitimate security concerns. It does have a real reason to be interested in Greenland, but there's very little it could achieve that it could not achieve by non-military means, which is to say, if they asked the Danish and the Greenlanders to put more forces there in order to counter the Russians and the Chinese as the Arctic ice melts, that will happen. There may be also a kind of rare earth minerals angle to this, where Greenland does have a huge number of those really valuable minerals and metals, which China has had a stranglehold on. But again, notwithstanding some environmental requirements, they're likely to get that. So if they ask for it. And so therefore, what I think we will see is that this is a little bit like threatening a 500% tariff, and then everybody being very happy when we all agree a 10 or a 20% tariff. It feels like that sort of debate is happening at the moment.
Meanwhile, the UN Human Rights Office says the U.S. operation to oust Maduro violates international law and undermines global security. What impact do you see this having on global security, and how significant is the UN's forceful language there?
Unfortunately, the UN's language, I think, sits at one side. It will sit on a bookshelf. Nobody really cares, unfortunately. The reality is that global security writ large is probably undermined. Well, we will see, I think, more regional states turning to force and violence to settle arguments rather than looking to a higher set of arbitration and negotiation. But in terms of a forthcoming world war, I think the American force and success in these operations has yet again demonstrated that they do sit apart. And recent statements by President Trump suggesting even a greater increase in US military expenditure would stamp that down. The Russians and the Chinese, who may have been relishing the last 5 days of disunity, will also be very clear that they don't want to fight against the US, and particularly not in its own backyard. And I think that particularly Russia will have been chastened. They gave their flag to a ship. They moved some ships into the area to provide some sort of protection, and the US went ahead regardless. So I think the Russian weakness, as it was with Iran, when the Americans bombed Iran, has been demonstrated really clearly. And that, I think, is probably a positive force for global security.
Steve, so what's your reaction to the president saying the U.S. could control Venezuela for years?
I mean, to some extent, the control that they appear to be looking for is a remote control, a coercive control from afar. If they can achieve that, I think it's much better than the alternative, which would be the US walking away and chaos reigning. What we seem to be moving towards is some sort of plan in a number of stages where we accept, if you like, the current regime for a period. And if we look back at the Iraq War, I mean, the criticism is that we didn't do that, and that was one of the reasons why there was failure in Iraq. But this is being done seeing both an economic and a political and a military dimension, which I think could be successful, but it's really unpredictable. And that's what we all hope will happen. I mean, I would much prefer that the US does remain engaged, that we do see some sort of accommodation between the Venezuelans and the American oil companies' interest and a political level, and a removal of the Cuban, Russian, and other forces that have been in Venezuela right on the doorstep of the US.
All right, Steve Hill, always great to have you to break these things down. Thank you.